Have you ever wondered what it would be like to just disappear? Not all at once, like in an abduction or having been lost at sea, but to slowly fade away, vanish bit by bit, until no one sees you or even really notices that you are gone. There is a Jewish proverb that goes something like this. It says, "Everyone dies twice, once at their physical death, but then again when that last person who remembers them dies as well. That is when someone is truly dead." And for most of us, your navigator included, this is the fate we will likely suffer. After we have passed, the living memory of our existence will slowly fade out until that moment when that last friend or grandchild or student who took a class from us has slipped their motor coil, and then we will fade forever into obscurity. This, of course, is less true now than it was a couple of centuries ago. We have more records and documents of our existence. Electronic media record more of our lives, either by our design or through happenstance. So too the apparatus of government, with various records of birth and death, marriage and divorce, deeds of ownership, licenses to perform certain activities such as drive or hunt, and memberships in various organizations, societies, and clubs. But in those documents of fact, there is a vitality that is certainly lacking, an absence of distinction. All of us are born and die. Most of us will decide to spend some portion of our lives with another person. Many of us will acquire the deed to a house or some other sort of property, and nearly everyone joins some collection of like-minded or purposed individuals. Those records, therefore, are but an incomplete account of those events in our lives that someone, the state, a company, an organization, deemed worth noting, but they are not us, at least not as individuals. While useful later to sociologists, demographers, and historians, they are in many ways anonymous, rendering the person behind the document invisible. And so it is, even in these days where social media and cell phones are so prevalent, a person can vanish. Only those who make a huge and lasting mark on society will be remembered, will live on past living memory. But sometimes, even fame or consequence is no guarantee of lasting immortality. As the 200-year-old poem, and by the way, 200 years old this year, by Percy Shelley tells us, "I met a traveler from an antique land, who said, 'Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away." Our story today is one such tale, nearly realized. The life of a man who, with a few colleagues, set out on a course to fundamentally change almost every aspect of scientific inquiry he touched, and by all accounts, broadly succeeded in that endeavor. And yet, even with these accomplishments, profound enough to merit a statue in the halls of Trinity College, Cambridge, next to none other than Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon, well, those accomplishments are scarcely remembered today. A giant in his own time, he is far too often now only a footnote in a few specialized monographs read by only a few scholars from time to time. His accomplishments are obscured by those of his close friends and colleagues, men like Charles Babbage, John Herschel, and Richard Jones, whose work in computing science, astronomy, and economics might not have occurred had it not been for his input and influence. Fortunately for us, however, he is not lost to memory completely. Too vast are his contributions, and too important are his own writings to have slipped into the sands of time to be lost forever. At least not yet. His work is too broad and far-reaching not to echo across the decades and indeed even the centuries to reach us now, And so we will go in search of the monuments he has left behind. A reformation of mathematics education that would enable things like the modeling of both gases and the emerging fields of electricity and magnetisms in due time. A new type of scientific society that welcomed all practitioners, and indeed, a new way of thinking about the process of doing scientific inquiry itself. William Whewell may be a nearly vanished giant, but those of us who have practiced science, those of us who are called scientists rather than natural philosophers or savants, owe much of our heritage to a man humbly born in a time of tremendous change. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 4, Science and Certainty. Episode 6, William Whewell, A Potent Life Forgotten. In our last episode, we were introduced to a young man taking leave of the life he was supposed to have in search of something completely outside of not only his experience, but the experience of nearly everyone close to him. While his mother was certainly a woman of letters, it might be said, publishing poetry in the papers of Lancaster and sharing the literature she so loved with her son, the academic life was something completely outside of the realm of those journeymen and apprentices he would have grown up with, working in his father's shop. Had it not been for that chance encounter with the Reverend Rowley at the fence, it is possible that William would have become a gifted carpenter, building houses for the wealthy industrialists of his hometown. But he was found by that pastor, and his mother's love of learning had shaped his intellect to seek to know more about the world around him. And so it was that he was set on the path that took him away from the hammer and the level and towards the conic sections and fluxions of Newton and Trinity College, Cambridge. But as with all things, this transition was not immediate, and not all at once. A person doesn't usually just drop everything and become something wholly new. As we said in the last episode, Whewell would carry with him his muscular, working-class upbringing, but he would also take with him his mother's love of poetry. So much so that among his notable acts as a student at Cambridge, he submitted a piece to the university in hopes of earning the newly established Chancellor's Gold Medal. This prize, established just a year after Whewell had arrived at Cambridge in 1812 by the university's Chancellor, Prince William Frederick, who was the Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh, was awarded for a poetic composition to be submitted anonymously by a member of the Cambridge University community. The topic for the poem was announced at the end of the fall term, with submissions to be received by the winter term's end. The winner of the medal would be selected, and then that person would read his poem before the university senate at commencement. The first winner of the medal had been George Waddington, who would go on to make a name for himself as a scholar of church history. In the second year of the prize, Cambridge's third at Cambridge, the young man from the North Country submitted a work titled Boudicca, a 360-line piece of epic poetry in heroic verse to be considered. Much to his and everyone else's surprise, I imagine, he won. The work, as you might have surmised, focused on the Celtic uprising against the Roman conquest of Britain, led by Queen Boudicca during the reign of Caesar Nero. While too long to read in full here, the work begins thusly. Tyrant of the earth, whose banner wide unfurled, waved o'er the ruins of a conquered world. O Rome, beneath yon heaven what region lies, but calls on thee the vengeance of the skies? What favored shore, where never thy legions dread, have crushed the flowers of peace with iron tread? But now, an outcast band, a robber horde, and now, of half the globe, the scourge and lord. Ausonia's plains beneath thy bondage groan, and Carthage sinks and leaves her place unknot. Even fair Athena, Caesar's sacred fane, shrink at thy touch, and mourn her Aegeus fane. For thee, the east her sparkling treasure spreads, for thee, her mountains lift their spicy heads. Ungorged with all the teeming orient yields, thou ask'st the north her bleak and barren fields. Indignant Ister rolls his subject flood, and feels his eddies warm with native blood. Albion looks forth from all her cliffs, thy oars bear war and bloodshed to her peaceful shores. Impatient still, while peace and freedom own one single spot beneath the starry zone. Later in the poem, Whewell introduces his hero. But why above the throng observant strains each eager gaze o'er all the crowded plains? 'Tis she, above the countless thousands seen, lifts her exalted form, the warrior queen. Her lofty forehead marked with high command, and stamped with majesty by nature's hand. Indignant freedom glows upon her cheeks, but on her front no milder passion speaks. Severe and stern, not her father's grace, the melting eye, the fascinating face. The charms that o'er each feature rove, and fix the gaze, and steel the soul to love. No, wouldst thou, fair woman's softened mold? O beauty, heaven-born queen, thy snowy hands hold round the earth in viewless magic hands. From Burns climes where riper graces flame, to shores where cliffs of ice resound thy name. From savage times ere social life began, to fairer days of polished, softened man. To thee from age to age, from pole to pole, all pay the unclaimed homage of the soul. Though not, Boudica, thine the dove-like eye, that asks omnipotent for sympathy. Yet to that stately form, that regal brow, might free-born pride and fearless valor bow. All hail, they Albion's much-loved queen, to thee, daughter of monarchs, monarch of the free, heiress of kings whose patriarchal sway the untamed Icean triumphs to obey. Oft have thy Britons seen a female hand pour life and gladness round a grateful land. Oft they've seen a woman's prowess guide the storm of war and stem the battle's tide. Even now they feel thy works, thy looks impart indignant courage to each free-born heart, and bid thee them on where freedom cries and vengeance beckons from angry skies. For those who know the story, of course, Boudica was not successful in her resistance, but instead became a symbol of Britain's ongoing resistance to the powers of the European continent, something quite relevant in the year before British forces, under the command of the Duke of Wellington, would once again cross the Channel to defeat Napoleon. I imagine Whewell's work found a welcome reception in the ears of many a patriotic British citizen. The announcement of the award, of course, bolstered Whewell's reputation as a student of some consequence in Cambridge, and the prestige of having been awarded the prize, one that in later years would go to Wadsworth and Tennyson, likely opened doors that would usually have been closed to a lowly sub-Caesar with a rough accent and rustic clothes from the north. As we have mentioned previously, there were two other involvements at Cambridge that would both raise Whewell's stature in the eyes of his fellow students and shape his outlook on his career going forward. The first of these was his involvement in what was known as the Cambridge Analytical Society. Started by Charles Babbage as something of a lark in around 1810 as a way to spread the continental approaches and notations to analytical mathematics, most notably calculus, the gatherings of the society would deeply shape Whewell's view of how mathematics should be done, something he would begin implementing in his role as a Fellow of Trinity a few years later. The other, of course, was the Philosophical Breakfast Club, where he, along with John Herschel, the aforementioned Babbage, Richard Jones, and a few others who came and went, spent Sunday mornings discussing issues related to the doing of science. Most of this discussion was centered around the works of Francis Bacon, and these would serve to inform the practice of all four men for the remainder of their long and productive lives. In 1816, Whewell would graduate with honors from Cambridge after passing the mathematics Tripos exam. A year later, he would be elected as a Fellow of Trinity College, establishing in himself what would be a lifelong tenure in that institution. Of his colleagues in the Philosophical Breakfast Club, he would be the only one that would remain at Cambridge. Herschel would pursue a life of private science, not an uncommon path for a man of independent financial means. Babbage, also a man from a family of significant wealth, would turn to invention, while Jones, who like Whewell came from a place of less economic prosperity, would, for a time, take holy orders and become a country parson before his writings in economics allowed him to earn a professorship and eventually join the East India Company's private training school. For Whewell, the fellowship meant that as long as he remained single, he could pursue whatever academic interests caught his fancy. Between the stipend his position afforded him and the tuition fees he could charge students he tutored at Cambridge to help them prep for their attempts at the Tripos exams, he could expect to live a more or less comfortable, if somewhat constrained life of scientific investigation. With that introduction, let's move on to the post-educational portion of Whewell's life. One of the difficulties of writing a biography of Whewell stems from the enormous amount of work he did that deserves commentary. Compounding this is the fact that unlike some figures such as Newton, whose work was largely grouped into just a few areas and was often confined to certain periods of their intellectual lives, Whewell's work was across a very broad array of disciplines, and, as is so often the case with the polymath, it was interleaved, so to speak, with papers, books, presentations, appointments, and contributions in multiple areas coming forth from his fertile mind seemingly just all the time. Perhaps the best way to think of this is to imagine a relentless intellect that inquired about all aspects of his experience and that had gotten into the habit of organizing its perceptions and thought into communicable forms almost instinctually. As we have seen, Whewell was a profoundly gifted communicator with an ability to use language to convey ideas almost effortlessly. Additionally, it may have been that, as is the case with so many academics, it was the process of teaching, with the attendant writing of lectures and notes that were then transformed into papers and books, that allowed to Whewell to synthesize his experience into broad and encompassing frameworks that would become so important as his life went on. So, with this in mind, what I think I'd like to do in order to disentangle the dizzying array of contributions is pick a topic, work through it to some degree, and then circle back to consider another. From time to time, we'll take a step back and try to get a bigger picture of things. With this in mind, I think it's fair to divide Whewell's career into three parts. His time as what we might call a junior member of the Cambridge community, the middle years of his work beginning with his selection as professor of mineralogy at the university, and finally, the final part of his life, dating from his selection as the Master of Trinity College to his death in 1866. The launch of Whewell's long academic career was a somewhat rocky one at first, in part due to circumstances, and in part due to his own headstrong nature. In the case of circumstance, just as Whewell had finished his Tripos examinations, his father passed away suddenly and was buried even before his son could travel back to Lancaster. It was a hard blow for young Whewell, and he wrote Herschel that his greatest regret in the entire thing was that his father had not gotten to see the fruits of the years of the financial sacrifice that he had borne. With his mother having passed in 1807, Whewell and his two younger sisters were now orphans, making it imperative he earn the fellowship. The other source of turmoil was one more of his own making. When in 1813 Herschel graduated, the meetings of the Philosophical Breakfast Club had come to an end. In an effort to fill the gap left by that departure, Whewell joined in 1814 the newly established Cambridge Union Society, which was sort of a combination of three older debate societies into an organization devoted to drinking a bit of ale and debating the events of the day from the perspective informed by what the students were studying. At first, this wasn't thought to be too big of a deal, but as the Napoleonic Wars came to an end and the British troops returned home, the overall economy of Britain suffered a downturn that resulted in rapidly rising bread prices and much higher unemployment. Not surprisingly, this led to civil unrest and even some rioting. When in 1817 a brick was thrown through the window of the Prince Regent's carriage, the government kind of went into lockdown mode, fearing that a Jacobean revolution was about to happen just as it had happened a generation earlier in France. So serious was this response that the Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, suspended habeas corpus during that time. That gives you a sense of how big a deal this was. At Cambridge, the administration followed suit and warned its various student clubs and societies that certain activities might be viewed as seditious. When Whewell's friend, Julius Hare, gave a talk at the society titled On the Question of the Propriety of the War Against France, that was sort of the last straw. A delegation of proctors was sent to close down the society, and Whewell, its president in 1817, stood against the men, asking that they leave the room while the society considered their demands. Very, French Revolution-esque if you think about it. The proctors, however, knew enough French history to realize that capitulating to these demands would only embolden the students, and so they did not budge. Whewell then switched tactics and said they would disperse, but only after they were granted a right to see the university's vice-chancellor. That idea worked, and Whewell led a group to meet Dr. Wood, master of St. John's College, who was serving in the role at the time, and they presented their case for allowing free speech to continue. Wood, however, was unmoved and shut the society down, a shuttering that would last for 4 years before the ban was removed and debates would once again take place. And it should be noted that the Cambridge Union Society continues to this day as one of the university's most venerable and distinguished institutions, hosting politicians, journalists, and scientists. In fact, Stephen Hawking's last public address before his death was to the society. What I find remarkable is that while one might think that being involved so directly in an active defiance against the university administration might have scotched Whewell's chances of being elected a Fellow of Trinity, the whole episode actually seemed to enhance his reputation as a man of vigorous intellect who was able to stand up in times of debate and work towards a goal. While his arguments were unsuccessful in swaying the mind of the vice-chancellor, they did make it clear to his colleagues that he was deeply committed to the principles upon which his education was founded. Soon after, now flush with free time with which to study since he couldn't go to the debate society anymore, he aced the fellowship exam and was in fact elected to a place at Trinity College. Now, to give one a sense of how much this was worth, the fellows of the college participated in what might be thought of as a sort of a profit-sharing program, where the monies from various lands and tithes that were granted to the university, as well as tuitions from the students, were split into dividends that were then shared. In the years between about 1821 and 1832, which are some years we have good records for, these shares netted a fellow an average of about £225 or so. To put that in context, recall that Whewell's father, John, had not earned enough money to be included on George III's taxation list, which had required a family to earn at least £50 a year. In short, the fellowship established Whewell and his sisters financially in a reasonably good state. Just as importantly, though, it was said that during this period, a fellow who took on maybe a dozen or so students as a tutor could earn an additional £1,000 or more, which would have actually been a pretty remarkable income at the time. The concurrent financial and intellectual independence of the awarding of the fellowship really was notable in Whewell's life for two reasons. The first was that it would enable him to embark on a course of action that would, along with contributions by Herschel, Babbage, and George Peacock, fundamentally reform mathematics education at Cambridge. The second was that it would allow him to once again profoundly broaden his cultural horizons. However, before we expand on these two things, I hope you'll be kind enough to indulge me in a very brief digression, and I do promise to keep it brief. In terms of the modern academy, what Whewell had achieved was something akin to what is now known as tenure. This is sort of the guarantee of a lifetime position and income to a person engaged in the intellectual work of an educational institution. It comes from academia's medieval roots as having arisen from the monastic schools of the Catholic Church, where monks and priests, after a certain amount of time as acolytes or lay monks, took holy orders and spent the remainder of their lives among the ranks of the clergy. Now, it should be noted that complaints about this sort of an institution, what we now call tenure in academic institutions, the complaints about this have been around for at least a millennium, and they've been leveled from all kinds of directions, from political figures, from monarchs, from other people inside of academia. But one of the things that's just really unfortunate is that these kinds of criticisms have increased in ferocity and frequency over the last couple of decades in many places. Here in my home, country of the United States, rarely a week goes by where there isn't somebody who isn't saying, well, why do these professors all get tenures? And so I'd like to make a few comments in association with that. In light of all of this sort of thing, one of the things I think is important to point out in our context is that it's hard to imagine Whewell or any number of other researchers during this time being able to make the types of contributions they did without a system that was like this. I will certainly be the first to admit that tenure has its problems, though, to be honest, the old canard that it protects unproductive members of an academic community is, frankly, unwarranted. Anyone who's been in a traditional business environment knows that there's always plenty of dead wood, even without the protections that those in academic environments enjoy. Really, this is as much a problem of good management and administration as it is anything else, so I think we can set that aside. What tenure allows for is the free and open exchange of ideas, that those with less power and privilege can speak truth, as it were, to those who have more. The problem with this system occurs when those who enjoy those protections either fail to use them to hold those in decision-making positions accountable to the principles and values of education and scholarship, or who use them to enhance their own prestige and power at the expense of those who lack it, as is too often the case in reference to those in contingent positions such as non-tenure track faculty, adjunct faculty, or with the treatment of student assistants. Like so many things of this sort, tenure is both a privilege and a responsibility when taken seriously, and as we will see, Whewell will view it as such in his interactions among the scientific world. And I think in that way, he very much stands as a paragon for those of us who now enjoy those sorts of freedoms and protections. So, with that digression completed, let us return to the early academic life of our subject. In many respects, Whewell followed the path of many a young fellow. He took on students to tutor, he was named a lecturer in mathematics, and he became involved in a number of projects. The first of these was to join and advance the goal of reforming the mathematics curriculum at Cambridge to more fully embrace the continental advances in that field. While Babbage, Herschel, and George Peacock worked to develop texts that would introduce English speakers to the methods of Leibniz and Laplace, Whewell took it upon himself to write a textbook he titled Mechanics. Basically, this was an advanced look at Newton's physics reconstructed along those same lines as the mathematicians were doing. So successful was he in this project that the book would be used as one of the standard texts on the subject in Britain for over a century. Its publication established him as a writer of some significant talent and ability. More importantly, it gave impetus for the mathematical reform in that it showed how powerful the new mathematical apparatus could be in treating real-world systems. It was probably on the basis of this text that Whewell was elected to the Royal Society in 1820. In 1823, he would write a second book titled Principles of Dynamics that would further entrench the continental approach as well as create a distinction between systems in what is known in what we call sort of static equilibrium and those undergoing changing motion. Engineering students the world over can thank Whewell for the fact that they take separate classes in statics and dynamics. The second area of work, what might be thought of as his original research in a modern sense, were his efforts in mineralogy and the fledgling field of geology. While Whewell's work spanned an enormous range of different areas, if there was one title we might think to give him, at least in the realm of sciences, it would be as an earth scientist. His focus in geology, at least at first, was focused really in the field of mineralogy, where he spent most of his time studying the structure of both minerals and geological strata that those minerals were found in. In this work, what you can really see is the influence of his study of physics and his work in motion. And he put forward the idea in a paper read at a meeting of the Royal Society of 1924 that crystals were actually aggregates of small rhomboids that were built up from scales that were too small to observe and measure into macroscopic structures. This conclusion, based on measurements made of various physical attributes of crystals, led him to suggest that the atomic structure of these sorts of minerals had to be lattice-like, a conclusion later affirmed in the 20th century. According to Herbert Diess, this work, quote-unquote, laid the foundations of mathematical crystallography, end quote. At about this same time, it became known that the professorship in mineralogy at Cambridge would become available upon the retirement of its present holder. Whewell made it known that he'd like to apply for the position, and so in 1825 he traveled to Germany to visit Carl Friedrich Mohs, Europe's preeminent geologist and author of the well-known system for determining the hardness of various minerals. Between 1826 and 1828, he and George Bidwell-Airy, then a student at Cambridge and later Astronomer Royal, spent a good deal of time working in the mines of England, trying to make measurements to determine the density of the Earth. While their efforts were ultimately unsuccessful in arriving at a result, the work garnered good reviews from the broader geological community due to its comprehensive and detailed nature, as well as the ingenuity of the methods being used. While the appointing of the position was held up for about 3 years due to a variety of political and administrative issues, these activities did, in 1828, secure Whewell that appointment. As if to demonstrate that his assignment was a good decision on the part of the Cambridge community, in that year he published a revision to Mohs' system of mineralogical classification. Finally, as a part of his broader geological data gathering, Whewell began traveling across the European continent after the cessation of the various wars with the French. In the course of these travels, he found himself increasingly fascinated by the different styles of architecture he found in the churches built in various periods. Most notably, he found himself wondering what might have spurred the development of the Gothic-style churches in Germany and France from the earlier Romanesque-style churches that had been constructed prior to the 12th century Renaissance. Now, at that time, there were a variety of ideas about what had given rise to distinct architectural styles, but these almost always invariably arose from this scholar or that scholar's pre-existing assumptions or biases. Whewell, committed as he was to the paradigm of Baconian induction, realized that what was needed was a comprehensive survey of different churches in a variety of different styles so that commonalities and differences could be documented and understood. Only once this had been done, Whewell believed, could relationships and causal factors be recognized. A concrete example of this had to do with the change in the style of the arch found in churches built in the earlier style to that of the latter. Romanesque churches have a characteristic rounded arch, very semicircular, that's seen in much of Roman architecture. However, in later Gothic churches, this rounded arch is replaced with what is commonly known as a pointed or bishop's arch. Prior to Whewell's work, the prevailing explanation for this was the barbarization of older classical architectural forms by Germanic invaders, hence the term Gothic. And so churches such as Notre Dame or Chartres were often described in aggressive terms by architectural historians who usually focused on specific architectural elements such as that presence of the pointed arch. Whewell, in distinction to this approach, desired to create a science of architecture, as it were, that, as just mentioned, focused on careful observations of the various elements of a structure, creating something like a biological or botanical taxonomy. By creating this classification system, the scholar or researcher would thereby have at ready hand a clear sense of what delineated different types of structures, be they churches, homes, government buildings, whatever, and then, from that, be able to speculate on what might have caused the differences. Just as would have been the case when he and Richard Jones rejected Ricardo's approach to economics that began with definitions rather than data, so Whewell claimed that a church couldn't be called Gothic just because it had pointed arches instead of rounded ones. Instead, over time, Whewell would develop the thesis that what separated the Gothic churches from their earlier Romanesque instances were not specific architectural elements, but rather a concept that would give rise to those differences, that of verticality over horizontality. Earlier churches, developed along Roman architectural ideas, took as their blueprint the Roman villa with its wide footprint and lower roofs. As these evolved to be applied to sanctuaries that would allow larger congregations together, the curved arch was used to transfer the structural load of the roof to the thick and often windowless walls. However, in the 12th century, an ethos of the church as a structure that reached upwards towards heaven and brought heaven to the congregation gathered into the sanctuary below developed. Something as a refuge from the brutal, unforgiving, and profoundly fallen world that people lived in. This ethos aspired literally to create structures that reached upward, and so new architectural innovations were required to bring about this new sense of verticality with thinner walls, more windows, and higher and less heavy ceilings. Whewell, drawing on his background in mechanics, recognized that one of the ways to achieve this was to adopt a stronger arch, one that more closely matched an optimum shape known mathematically as a catenary curve. The bishop's arch more closely approximated this shape than the old Roman round arch did, and so could bear the structural load more effectively while also adding to the upward-reaching impression of the structure. Whewell then showed that as time went on, the builders of the churches and cathedrals recognized that similar principles could be used first to replace the heavy-barreled ceilings and then reinforce the walls of the even higher structures with flying buttresses that took the load of the now very lofty roof off the walls almost entirely. This allowed for the inclusion of more windows, soon made of stained glass, that let in even more light from higher above the gathered congregation, thus drawing their attention upwards to the heavens rather than being oppressed under the weight of a low, heavy, Romanesque roof. In this, Whewell was able to compellingly argue that, counter to the prevailing opinion, Gothic architecture represented a breathtaking advance over, rather than a barbaric retreat from, earlier classical forms of architecture. In his new approach, architectural beauty and elegance arose from structures that used unifying principles or ideas to bring harmony to the entirety of the building, while those who used an unconsidered mix of different ethos were thought of as, in his words, barbaric or degenerate. Just as importantly, this exercise solidified in Whewell's mind the sense that science was more than just a collection of facts or observations. Far too often, he realized, that without some sort of unifying idea or principle, a pile of data would be incomprehensible. However, if a scientist could develop some overarching structure in which to place all the information, those data would be clarified into a robust and understandable whole. As an example of this, Whewell would later refer to the data gathered by Tycho Brahe. As we've discussed in a previous episode of the podcast, this data was exquisite in its precision and significant in its quality and quantity. But without the correct framework in which to place it, it was just a confusing jumble of numbers. However, once Kepler realized that if he not only assumed that Mars moved in a non-circular orbit, but, as a fellow planet, so did the Earth, this jumble of seemingly contradictory data quickly resolved itself into a self-consistent picture, where the data confirmed Kepler's conceptual model and allowed him to precisely calibrate that model so it would be able to predict the future positions of the planets in the sky with incredible accuracy. As a conclusion to this section of Whewell's life, I want to take a moment to consider what all of this, as well as other activities in the areas such as political economics, philosophy, and languages, tells us about the mind of this man. When I look at the breadth of Whewell's interests and contributions, I see a person whose first question was often, why? For many, walking into a Gothic cathedral engenders expressions of awe and appreciation, and I expect this was true for Whewell as well. However, his mind didn't stop there. He went to that next place. He began to ask these questions. Why did this particular church get built? And why did it get built the way it did? Why was it different than the other churches? And what function did those differences serve? Once he started asking those questions, he then mustered his prodigious skills as an observer and his profound faith in inductive approaches to gathering, organizing, and relating data in order to better understand whatever it was he was studying. From that, he then sought principles that would give that data structure and order in ways that other principles would not. This was his process of inquiry, and as we have seen, and as we will see, it allowed him to engage in inquiry in a way that was just profoundly and powerfully effective. If inquiry can be defined as asking questions and then seeking answers to those questions in an organized fashion, Whewell's developing method gave him a powerful tool to answer all of the whys that his mind kept asking. With his appointment as Cambridge's professor of mineralogy, we can sort of mark the end of the beginning of Whewell's academic career and move into what might be thought of as the mature stage of his scientific activities. Whewell, of course, didn't really see it that way, but the appointment serves as a good marker of the fact that he had become recognized as a force within the scientific and academic community of Britain. For this middle stage, we will again focus on three things that he worked on, but as before, there will be a number of contributions we will leave out. Most notably his work on continuously updating previous writing and ideas to account for new data, better methods, or further thinking. This will actually be a pattern Whewell will evidence throughout his life. For him, knowledge was never a static thing. It was always in motion, always developing, changing, becoming fuller and more insightful. It can be said that Whewell, for all of the conservatism he will evidence in certain matters later in his life, had what could be called a progressive view of the human story. For him, the doing of science, indeed, of all inquiry, was a journey of taking humanity from a state of ignorance to one of better understanding of the world it inhabited. While he recognized that in many cases and ways humanity's knowledge fell far short of understanding the universe completely or fully, he recognized the journey as much as one away from ignorance as it was one towards truth. As we look at the middle of his career, we will consider three topics: his work on tides, his contributions to what is known as natural theology, and his efforts to reform and professionalize the doing of science. In the late 1820s, the scientific understanding of tides, the periodic rise and fall of water levels on the shores of oceans, seas, and even large lakes, was a pretty limited thing. While Newton's Principia had given a generalized explanation, one that had been further developed along two separate lines, one by Daniel Bernoulli and the other by Simon Laplace, these theoretical descriptions and explanations didn't do a very good job of predicting the specifics of the tides in specific locations. As we discussed in an earlier episode on Edmund Halley, the third expedition of the Paramour had actually been not only to map the coastlines on either side of the English Channel, but also to determine the tidal variations. This was a matter of great importance to an island nation such as Britain, but not just in matters of warfare and national security. Many of England's ports, like that of Whewell's hometown of Lancaster, are what are known as estuary ports, meaning that they're inland, up the waterways a little bit. As such, the ability of ships to sail from the ocean up those rivers and estuaries was dependent on when the high tide occurred. In Newcastle, for example, the newer and larger ships with deeper drafts could only reach the docks in about a 1-hour period of highest tide. This was not a new problem, of course. Francis Bacon, during his tenure as Lord Chancellor, had called for an international effort to make observations of the tide as a way to try to come to a better understanding of the phenomenon. Halley's work can be seen as a very limited extension of that. It was Whewell, however, as was so often the case, who decided to pursue Bacon's program through the path that, turned out to be quite a bit more convoluted than you'd expect. Back in the early 1800s, the famous physicist Thomas Young, the man who would, by the way, demonstrate the wave nature of light, had written several papers on tides, and in one of these had made the case that the British government should follow up on Bacon's suggestions that had been made 2 centuries earlier. As before, this had been more or less ignored until a former student of Whewell's, one John Lubbock, came along. Lubbock had graduated from Cambridge and had become a baker. In 1830, he had decided to invest some money in the Port of London, specifically in a project known as the Catherine Docks. Wanting to know how to maximize his investment, Lubbock decided to see if there was any data on the tides, specifically the timing of the high tides, in order to know when he could expect ships to come up the Thames. When he went looking, he found that the Port Authority had been keeping tide records since 1805, but they hadn't actually done anything with the data. Realizing that he was sitting on a bit of a gold mine, Lubbock hired a man from the hydrographic office, and the two of them began calculating the correlation between the times of high tide and things like the time of year and the position and phase of the moon and its, position with respect to the sun, all of those kinds of things. Lubbock would write up his results and have them published in the Transactions of the Royal Society, work for which he would be awarded the Society's gold medal in 1834, which attests to its importance. On the way to doing that, however, Lubbock began corresponding with his old tutor at Cambridge, Whewell. As you might expect, the letters back and forth got Whewell interested in the subject, and soon he was planning for an even bigger project than what his former student had accomplished. What Whewell wanted to do was see if he could create a map of when high tides took place all over the world so he could see if he could connect those times in what he called co-tidal lines on a map of the world. In other words, he was trying to map the progress of the high tide around the world as the Earth rotated on its axis. Now, this seems like it might be a pretty simple thing to do, but in actuality, it required the coordination of accurate and consistent observations from coastal stations all around the world. Given the number of experts in the fields of geology or oceanography, there just weren't enough people to do the work. And so Whewell knew that he would have to rely both on the broader scientific community, but also on members of the general public, fishermen, port officers, property owners, those kind of folks. While each of these groups certainly had the capacity and interest to make such observations, Whewell had to ensure that those observations were done both uniformly and accurately. To do this, he developed a standard form as well as a set of clear and simple instructions, and then began publicizing the project through scientific gatherings, nautical magazines, and even missionary publications. The big break in the project came, however, when Whewell managed to convince Francis Beaufort, and yes, that Francis Beaufort, the one of the wind strength scale, to engage in the data-taking aspect of the project. Beaufort had worked his way up through the British Navy to become responsible for the scientific missions that the Navy sponsored. Having had so much success with Halley's scientific missions in the late 1600s and early 1700s, his or Her Majesty's Navy, kind of depends on which time, right, had kept up the practice of outfitting and funding missions of exploration and scientific investigation. In fact, it was Beaufort who had just selected Charles Darwin as the chief naturalist for the mission of the HMS Beagle that sailed in December of 1831. Whewell knew Beaufort through a series of mutual relations, and so, as the project got started, he reached out to the Navy man to see if there was any way he could get the Navy to take some data for his project. Beaufort, though, went one better than that. He ordered all stations of the British Coast Guard to take tidal data every 15 minutes for 2 solid weeks in June of 1834. When Whewell did an analysis of that data, he realized that if he could get a worldwide sample, that would be even better. And so, on Beaufort's urging, the Duke of Wellington, who was kind of the Prime Minister of England at this time, took up the cause and lent his diplomatic support to the project. And so it was that for 20 days in June of 1835, thousands of observers in 9 countries, along with their colonies, took observations of the tides every 15 minutes. The data haul here was just absolutely enormous, with over 40,000 data points collected and transmitted to Whewell. And just to take this to a whole nother level, what you have to recall is this was all done before the widespread use of telegraph. There was no chance for Whewell to correspond back and forth between where he was and different stations that were trying to take data. So well thought out were Whewell's instructions and forms to record that data that everything went off without a hitch, which is a truly remarkable achievement just in and of itself. From that data, Whewell created tables of high and low tides based on things like weather, wind, position and phase of the moon, and position of the sun for many positions around the globe. It would be work for which he would be awarded the Royal Society's Gold Medal, though his friend John Herschel somewhat jokingly suggested that it would be more fitting had he been presented a crown of seaweed inscribed with the words Mare Divicto, or The seas conquered. Unfortunately, Whewell's hope of creating a full co-tidal map for the entire globe turned out to be frustrated. While he was able to show how the tides progressed through and across the Atlantic into the various shores and rivers of Britain and Europe, he was not able to extend that level of understanding to the entire globe. His assumption that there was something like a complete, single, progressive wave that traveled around the entire planet was shown by the data to be incorrect. Nevertheless, the characterization of what was happening in the Atlantic Basin was a tremendous accomplishment, and Whewell's maps from the 1840s often match very closely with today's computer-generated tidal simulations based on the equations of differential gravity and fluid dynamics. For the sailors of the North Atlantic, the benefit of Whewell and Lubbock's work were almost immediate. By 1850, the British Admiralty had published tidal tables for over 100 ports, making sailing the tricky waters more predictable and thus much safer. In this way, Whewell fulfilled another of Francis Bacon's dictates, that science should be used to better the human condition. It is likely that untold thousands of sailors did not drown as a result of avoiding the pitfalls of sailing close to shore on unpredictable tides. Overall, Whewell would publish over a dozen major papers on the topic of tides, or what he dubbed tidology, and by many accounts, this would be his most important piece of scientific work. The second thing I'd like to talk about is Whewell's contribution to the subject of natural theology. For those of you who listened to our episodes on Arthur Stanley Eddington, you'll recall that natural theology was a philosophical discussion about the intersection between natural philosophy and religion that came about in the middle of the 19th century as an attempt to reconcile the growing disparity between the views of what was becoming the increasingly divergent ideas in the scientific community and the religious one. Since the time of at least Newton, though one might go as far back as Galileo, there had been descriptions of the natural universe that contradicted with long-held religious views. These, of course, resided more in the question as to how one understood scriptural interpretation, i.e., whether that was to be done literally or more loosely in a metaphorical or allegorical sense, and who had the authority to undertake that task, i.e., the ecclesiastical structure of the religious organization that claimed authority from the scripture, i.e., the church, or some duly appointed apparatus such as a church council, the clergy at the local level, or even in some cases, the common layperson as guided by the Holy Spirit. In Catholic countries, this had been settled by the Council of Trent and the subsequent, though inconsistent, action of the Inquisition. In a Protestant country like Britain, however, the picture was a good deal muddier. The work of men such as Boyle, Newton, and Halley had made it clear that in scientific matters, evidence and facts could outweigh religious opinion, and so the doctrine of an earth-centered universe was rejected far earlier and more completely there than in some Catholic countries in Europe. This is not to say that some religious traditions, usually more conservative than the Anglican Church, didn't adhere to older understandings much longer. The Reformed Church, or Puritans as they are usually known in the context of British and American history, were much slower to accept the scientific view of the solar system, for example. This problem kind of came to a head in the 1820s and 1830s as the field of geology moved from the task of simply classifying different sorts of rocks and minerals to attempting to develop organizing principles and models to describe how these rocks and minerals formed. The upshot of this work, carried on by the likes of Charles Lyell, with whom Whewell would maintain a long and fruitful correspondence, gave rise to an idea that first broached by Edmund Halley over 100 years earlier, but now taken more seriously as evidence began to accumulate. That being that the Earth was a good bit older than the 4,000 to 6,000 year timeline that had been held by Christians for quite a while. The evidence was clearly in support of a much older Earth, one that had been around for millions, if not billions of years. As this crisis, if such a term could be used, developed, there was a recognition of new understandings of how God's agency in the creation could be reconciled with a universe seemingly governed by mathematical laws that were in contradiction with Holy Scripture. The response to this was to adopt a complementarian view of the two things that sort of originated in that two books theological position of Thomas Aquinas, that the mind of God could be most fully understood by reading both the books of nature and Scripture. This was pushed forward first by the Protestant reformers Luther and his right-hand man Melanchthon, and in England, Francis Bacon. By the late 18th century, this point of view had been taken up and most completely put forward by an Anglican priest by the name of William Paley. Paley, who wrote a number of very influential books on the topic, had been a senior wrangler at Cambridge and a fellow at Christ College there. His principles of moral and political philosophy and a view of the evidence of Christianity were required reading during Whewell's years at Trinity until Whewell himself replaced them with his own work after being promoted to the master of the college. For our purposes, the most important of Paley's writings was titled Natural Theology, or Evidences for the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, collected from the appearances of nature. This book had been published in 1802. In it, Paley made the now famous and familiar watchmaker's argument for the existence of God. For those of you who might not be familiar with that argument, it goes something like this. Imagine you're walking along a heath or an open field, and you stumble upon a stone. This would not be of any surprise to you, and thus you wouldn't require any explanation for it. However, if instead you came across a finely crafted watch just laying there, you would have a very different reaction to that. Watches don't just happen. They don't just sort of form laying there on the open field. The fine craftsmanship and exquisite design of the mechanical device suggests that such an intricate thing could not just happen randomly as the stone might have happened. Instead, Paley argued, you'd be led to believe that the watch was a made artifact, fashioned by a watchmaker of great skill and creativity with an understanding of both form and function that was not possible by mere random chance. He then went on to say that just as when we come across things that are just as accurate and complex in nature as the watch is, we are led to the same sort of conclusion. Consider the human eye, Paley asked his reader. Is it not a wondrous thing, with all of the parts, each intricate and devoted to a specific function, that when working in conjunction with the other parts, creates an organ that is able to do the wonderful things associated with sight? Just as one requires a watchmaker in order to fashion something like a watch, so too, Paley argued, must there be a grand designer to fashion such wonders as the human eye. By the way, if this argument sounds very familiar and modern, this is because it has been, in recent years, taken over by those of the intelligent design movement. Paley's argument, now shown by direct experience to be untrue in the natural world, was that such complex things cannot come about by merely random processes. Paley just didn't have things like quantum mechanics and its understanding of the probabilistic nature of microscopic physical processes, nor the understanding of how things like natural selection can shape biological development. And so he asserted that God's hand was shown in every designed thing in nature, from the most delicate petal of some tropical flower to, using Carl Sagan's example from Cosmos, the face of a Japanese warrior on the carapace of a species of crab. In his view, God was the grand designer whose hand was in every glorious aspect of nature. This, of course, raised certain questions. One of those was, what about the really ugly things? I mean, why would a God as aesthetically gifted as he that would design the perfect angles of a quartz crystal or the iridescent colors of the feathers of a peacock also design something as ugly as a cockroach or as repulsive as any number of arachnids? And by the way, no offense to the lovers of spiders and other such critters. You understand what I'm saying, right? Moreover, what about the imperfections that arose? Malformed eyes and twisted limbs in infants, for example. While some might argue that these were a result of the fallen nature of the creation, why were such occurrences so random and infrequent? While such objections weren't seen as being truly crippling to the argument of Paley's natural theology, they were seen as a problem to be solved. For Whewell, the solution was to remove God as the direct agent in the chain of causation. While Whewell was a strong believer in the consistency between nature and religion, and he was a man of great faith, he didn't hold to the view of the divine that had to make and craft each and everything in the creation. Instead, much like Kepler had done, Whewell came to see God as a writer of the laws of nature that would govern all physical processes to produce what was observed around us. While we can't be sure of this, it seems that the impetus for Whewell's direct consideration of these topics in the mid-1820s was an outgrowth of having to take holy orders to retain his fellowship. Having been made a fellow in 1818, he was required to take this step to remain at Trinity College in that role within 7 years. Not bothering with the process until he reached the required time, the necessary preparations seemed to have spurred him to consider his views on the dual nature of the topics at the same time he was corresponding with Lyell over the latter's views of an old-age Earth. These views remained fairly private until the 1830s, when Whewell's growing reputation as a man of some scientific merit and his position as an ordained priest made him a natural candidate for the long-standing project known as the Bridgewater Treatises. These works, named after the Earl of Bridgewater, who had died in 1829 and left the princely sum of some £8,000 for the writing of a book or series of books, the treatise's stated goal was to expound on how sciences could serve religion through increasing one's faith in the divine. As Bridgewater's will stated, the work should, quote, illustrate the power, the wisdom, and the goodness of God as manifested in the creation, end quote. To select the writers of the various volumes of the treatises, Bridgewater had tasked the president of the Royal Society, at that time a man by the name of Davies Gilbert, who would consult with the archbishops of London and Canterbury in making the choice for each author. After first considering John Herschel, Gilbert, on the recommendation of London's archbishop, chose Whewell to write the treatise on astronomy, thought to be of special importance as it would show God's glory as being visible in the very heavens over the reader's head. Whewell took his charge very seriously, taking over a year and a half to write the book. His goal was to, quote, show that every advance in our knowledge of the universe harmonizes with the belief of a most wise and good God, end quote. His frontispiece quote for the work came from Newton's Principia, quote, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being, end quote. No matter that, Newton's concept of this being was profoundly and heretically different than the one Whewell was invoking. As mentioned earlier, while Whewell agreed with Paley that science and religion should be complementary in the knowledge they produce and provide, Whewell was different in that he stated that God was not most powerfully evidenced in the individual expressions of his creation, things such as eyeballs or flower petals, but rather in the natural laws themselves that brought these things about, each in their own way, suited to their own environments. In his words, quote, nature acts by general laws, end quote. Laws, he thought, were written by a providential and law-giving God. Our recognition of this, Whewell argued, in fact forces even the most skeptical person into the realization that the universe must have been designed by an intelligent being who understood the vital nature of these laws. And I'll leave it for the listener to determine if they are so compelled by Whewell's argument. In the closing chapters of the book, Whewell went on to discuss the proper way to do science so that these laws could be duly uncovered for the betterment of human condition. This writing prefigured his later, much more comprehensive work on that topic. The Bridgewater volume would become by far the most popular in the series, going through some 9 editions during Whewell's life alone. The advance he received for writing the book made him rich, and it brought him a popular notoriety for the first time that would never actually fade during his lifetime. So influential was the work that it would dominate the discussion of natural theology well into the 20th century. Perhaps, as importantly, it would profoundly influence a young naturalist by the name of Charles Darwin, who had just returned from the Galapagos Islands. In a few years, Darwin would publish his seminal work, Origin of Species, and on its frontispiece, he would quote, above a quote from Francis Bacon, Whewell's words from the Bridgewater Treatise, quote, but with regard to the material world, we can go at least as far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power, exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws." End quote. The final topic I'd like to cover in this episode is Whewell's role in reforming what might be thought of as the nature of professionalism in scientific practice, primarily through reconsidering and recasting the scientific society. To understand this, we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture in British science in the early part of the 19th century. And to do this, we need to look at two things: who did science and what institutions were in place to support the doing of scientific research. The first group was a very limited number of individuals, most of whom were of what might be called independent means. State or public support of scientific research was extraordinarily limited at this time in Britain. While other nations, such as France and Prussia, had moved to models where men of demonstrated scientific talent could garner some form of state funding, usually through national scientific societies, for their research or discoveries, Britain had no such system. While there were occasionally research endeavors undertaken through either the Navy or the Royal Observatory, the only positions that might be thought of as professional in the sciences were the few professorships in the various universities around England, and the fellowship system associated with colleges at a few universities, as we've seen at Cambridge. To give you a sense of how limited the number of professorships were at this time, Cambridge had fewer than a dozen professorships and only 3 associated with the sciences. At Oxford, the numbers were similarly limited. In all of England and Scotland, there were likely only a few dozen individuals in paid positions associated with what might be thought of as scientific research. That's less than what one might find at a single, modern, medium-sized regional public university, West State University or East State University in the United States. To this, one might add the fellows at places like Cambridge, but you need to recall that these individuals were under no requirement to do research or investigation of any particular sort, and that they were usually engaged in a lot of activities associated with tutoring students. For every fellow, like Whewell, who made time to engage in research as a fellow while tutoring and lecturing, there were many who did not. Furthermore, much of the research and scholarship that was done was focused in areas such as mathematics, classics, theology, and moral philosophy. Here again, if the fellows might be compared to either graduate students or postdoctoral associates, then there were probably fewer of them engaged in scientific research than what one might find at a single present-day research university. So who did the science in Britain? For the most part, it was what might be thought of as gentlemen researchers, men like Thomas Young or John Herschel, who were of scientific inclination and who possessed enough wealth that they either didn't need to have a regular job or whose job allowed them enough free time that they could engage in some level of sustained observation. When you read of the great Victorian researchers in Britain, over and over, one finds it being done not necessarily by the best and brightest as identified by a formal education system, but by those with the wealth to pursue what might be thought of as something more like a hobby and less like a vocation. While men like John Herschel and maybe to a lesser degree Charles Babbage had enormous talent and intellect and thus made significant contributions to their fields of research, there were many whose efforts were disorganized, half-hearted, and just unfocused. Just as importantly, many of those who did show talent while enrolled in universities were forced to take jobs after graduation that left them no time to pursue what they had demonstrated they were really good at. Since there was no infrastructure of support, a great number of good scientific minds ended up taking positions in administration, or as lawyers, or as clergy. The second factor in this was really the Royal Society. While it had been founded as a sort of realization of Francis Bacon's ideal gathering of those seeking knowledge, was something known as Solomon's House in Bacon's writings, the biggest flaw in the organization was that it had no means of support apart from dues and donations from its members. There was no public or state support for its activities. From the beginning, this meant that the Royal Society was dependent on the contributions of rich individuals to support and sponsor its various activities. This meant that while the goal was, to have election to the society that was supposed to be based on scientific accomplishment, it didn't take very long before that election had as much to do with who might be able to contribute to the society as it did for scientific work. By the early 1800s, the organization had become something of a moribund body of questionable scientific merit. While there were certainly those elected who did do good science, many of those who were brought into the society were little more than either dilettantes or, even worse, charlatans of sorts. Hence, the Royal Society at this time tended to exacerbate the issues of the British scientific community rather than work to find solutions as the country began to fall further and further behind, at least scientifically, its continental peers and rivals. All of this came to a head in 1828 when Charles Babbage published a book titled Reflections on the Decline of Science in England. In it, Babbage pulled no punches in lamenting the state of British science in comparison to what he saw in France and castigating those he saw as being in positions of leadership, especially in the Royal Society. While not entirely accurate in its depictions, it was a scathing indictment, and the scientific community in England was stunned by what it read. Soon after, additional critical works were published by others, including the noted physicist David Brewster. One of the works that came out after Babbage's critique was titled Science Without a Head, or The Royal Society Dissected. Other writers soon rushed into the fray to defend or at least explain the origins of the British way of doing things and to point out that Babbage had presented a somewhat rosy picture of what had been going on in other places. In short, a space was opened up in the public square to debate the future of natural philosophy in Britain, given the fact that the British were very wary of overly intrusive government involvement in human affairs. Whewell, along with others such as Herschel and Young, shared Babbage's and Brewster's concern, but they were less enthusiastic about the idea of calling out the establishment. Part of this had to do with the leadership of the Royal Society. For about 4 decades, beginning in the later 1700s right up till 1820, the society had been led by a man by the name of Joseph Banks. Banks was a botanist who had made his name on the voyages of James Cook, on the HMS Endeavour, and whose work is now enshrined in the name of Botany Bay in Australia. Banks was an old money sort of guy, and he believed that the Royal Society should reflect that. Thus, if you didn't come from British high society, that part of the culture, you really had to do some pretty amazing work to even get elected to the Royal Society. And then, even if you passed Banks' muster on that point, it was really well known that you couldn't cross him, or he'd more or less blacklist you. Hence, most of those who were part of the scientific establishment or scientific community were really a lot more conservative in their approach to confrontation than Babbage had been. And this, by the way, extended to anyone who might consider forming rival scientific societies. So influential was Banks that if somebody got on his bad side, they could basically kiss any sort of government support of their activities, limited as it might be, goodbye. And so Banks sort of ruled over the scene with a velvet-gloved iron fist, might be said. When he died in 1820, things started to change, though. The first part of that was, in the 1820s, 2 other scientific societies got founded. One, the Astronomical Society, eventually to be the Royal Astronomical Society, was started by Babbage and Herschel, men too wealthy and too established to be affected by any censure Banks or his successors could level at them, and the other was the Geological Society, of which Whewell would be a founding member. As an aside, the Geological Society wasn't the first rival organization Whewell had been a part of founding. In 1819, a year before Banks's death, as a freshly minted fellow, he had joined John Henslow, Adam Sedgwick, and a number of other young scholars at Cambridge to form what is now called, or what was known then as well, the Cambridge Philosophical Society. This move had profoundly angered Banks and threatened to derail the men's careers, and would likely have done so had Banks not died in 1820. Over the following several years, the presidents of the Royal Society had come and gone, but there were no real changes to how things were being run, which of course led to Babbage's published indictments of the organization. The furor created by this led the then president, Davies Gilbert, who we mentioned earlier, to offer his resignation, which led to what was seen as a fight for the future of the society and even for science itself in 1830. One side supporting electing the Duke of Sussex to the position of the presidency, a move that would push the society further in the direction of becoming little more than another meaningless title of the landed aristocracy, while a group of reformers coalesced around the candidacy of John Herschel, a man of science who would move the society back towards its original intent. The story of this battle is too long to tell here, especially as this episode continues to stretch on, but it was a difficult and bruising fight, and in the vote, Herschel lost by a narrow margin. For Herschel, the stress of the process was so taxing, and the loss so disappointing, that he would leave England for a number of years to do astronomical and biological work in South Africa, thus absenting himself, at least directly, from what was to come. For men such as Whewell, the result was such that they resolved to establish the new society open to all those who practiced scientific research. Initial leaders in this effort were Whewell, Babbage, and Brewster, the latter two having written those original critiques. They called for a meeting to be held in York that would invite people to attend from all over England, Ireland, and Scotland. No elected membership would be required to attend or present, in stark contrast to the Royal Society's practices. One of the reasons for this, besides the centrality of the location, was that there had been a thriving philosophical society there for over a decade. Its leader, a man called Vernon Harcourt, had numerous connections and was a respected researcher, and so was a perfect choice to head up sort of what might be thought of as the local organizing committee. It was Harcourt who suggested that the new body's name be the British Association for the Advancement of Science, a title taken from one of Francis Bacon's work titled The Advancement of Learning. That first meeting in York would take place in 1831, and it would mark the beginning of a new type of scientific organization, not only in England, but in all of the world, where any person could become a member, and if their work passed basic peer review, present their findings to their colleagues. For his part, Whewell did a lion's share of the practical work of getting the structure of the new association organized. Any such organization needs committees and disciplinary sections and subsections, officers, financial documents, and a whole host of other things. Whewell, from his position as a professor at Cambridge, had the time and connections to seek out individuals to fill roles, draft bylaws, and send letters of invitation. Without these efforts, the British Association would never have gotten off the ground or continued after its very successful first meeting. Records of that meeting show that 353 participants gathered in what was the largest scientific meeting that had ever been held on British soil. Most came from the northern part of the kingdom, and only a few members of the Royal Society attended, but perhaps the greatest strength of the organization was that it welcomed those of dissenting faiths, such as the Quakers, who had been shut out of both of the Oxbridge universities and the older scientific societies. Most notable of these, of course, was John Dalton, the author of the modern atomic theory, who attended every meeting from 1831 until his death in 1837. Whewell would remain active in the association for the rest of his life and would be, as Harcourt noted, quote, the intellectual atlas, end quote, of the organization, supporting it on his broad shoulders as it worked to become established. In 1833, Whewell held the association's annual meeting at Cambridge, and it was really the association's coming out party, and along with that, Whewell's final establishment as the leader of Britain's scientific community. During a week, late in June of that year, 852 members of the association gathered to hear talks, be feted, and exchange ideas. On Tuesday of that week, the 24th, Whewell gave the opening keynote of the conference, and it is here that one of the most famous stories associated with him occurred. Whewell, in his late 30s, at what was the height of his rhetorical power in many ways, stood to address the assembled gathering. Even though he had recently resigned as professor of mineralogy in order to devote the time required to do the work that had established the association, he was now famous for his writings. For over an hour, he held forth on his view of natural philosophy, calling astronomy queen of the sciences, extolling the need for science to work with both fact and theory, recalling the work and words of Francis Bacon which had guided him those last 15 years. He was spellbinding and compelling, and his audience was drawn into his intellectual web. As the applaud died out following the address, a single man rose from his seat to address Whewell. It was the celebrated author and poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge, though, was not just a figure in the Romantic movement, but also a man who spent a good deal of time thinking about and studying natural philosophy. Years earlier, he had actually written a short work regarding the proper methods by which natural philosophy could be conducted. For the previous 3 decades, though, Coleridge had rarely left his home in Highgate, but on this occasion, at the gathering, he decided he could remain silent no longer. It would be his last such trip, as he would die a year later. And he had an issue, an axe to grind, and in his mind there was no one better to grind it with than William Whewell and the association that Whewell had helped bring into existence. Rising to face the speaker, Coleridge, perhaps emboldened by the recent attacks on the scientific establishment, launched into a diatribe against the gathered assemblage of practitioners. At issue was the designation by which they referred to themselves, i.e., natural philosophers. While certainly men such as John Dalton, who contemplated the nature of matter, might aspire to such a lofty title, most of those in the room who did so brought injury to it. Engaged as they were in the digging for fossils, or tinkering with electrical apparatus, or building calculating machines, they were not worthy to be called philosophers, true philosophers, ones who pondered the mystery of the universe in order to prize from it eternal truth and beauty. They were, in Coleridge's words, practical men with dirty hands. As he closed his sort of diatribe, he told them that as a quote-unquote real metaphysician, he hereby forbade them to use the honorific philosopher at all. As you might imagine, this screed did not exactly go over well in the hall. There were shouts of protest and disagreement from the more than 800 attendees that felt as though they and their profession had been unjustly insulted. In this moment, however, Whewell saw a chance to reframe the conversation. Not only the conversation in the hall, but the conversation about science in the nation. Rising once again and quieting the crowd, Whewell courteously agreed with Coleridge that perhaps philosopher was, in his words, quote, too wide and lofty a term, end quote. Instead, Whewell suggested, quote, by analogy with the artist, we may form scientist, end quote. And so it was that a word was born. Just as one who produced art was an artist, so too, Whewell claimed, was one who produced scientific results a scientist. It was, in a stroke, a brilliant reframing of the debate that had occurred over the last 5 years, beginning with Babbage's attack on the Royal Society and the practice of science in general. It aimed to take science completely out of the medieval idea of philosophical contemplation and place it into a professional context of human beings working rather than thinking to understand nature. It was not mere contemplation, but instead the production of ideas and understandings, facts and models that work together to create not just a better understanding of the world, but a better world and condition for humankind. In taking this approach, Whewell pushed forward an agenda that made those who did science placed on a level with other professions such as lawyers, engineers, and bankers. Now, to be clear, this wasn't a case where Whewell just made the suggestion of renaming those who practiced the doing of science, and everyone just went along with it. As good as his response was in diffusing the tension in the room on that June 24th, 1833 moment, the term didn't catch hold immediately, or even within a few decades. While he would continue to use the word scientist, he was ignored for a long time. Later, as his writings continued to be popular in the public square, the term would actually be mocked and used almost as an insult or a sneer. However, in time, as science became more professionalized, as professorships increased and public support became more common, the term slowly gained widespread acceptance until, after Whewell's death, it was commonplace enough that men like J.J. Thomson and Ernest Rutherford, working at Cambridge, were referred to not as natural philosophers, but as scientists. As we wrap up this episode, let me say a few more words about Whewell's knack for coining terms. Throughout the 1820s and 1830s, as part of his correspondence with any number of other researchers, he would suggest words to act as a sort of shorthand for more complicated physical ideas. In his letters to Lyell on geology, he offered the terms uniformitarianism and catastrophism to describe the two views on the timescales in which geological activity took place. To the young researcher at the Royal Institution, Michael Faraday, he suggested the terms ion, cathode, and anode in relation to the various phenomena observed in the intersection between chemistry and electrical research, now known as electrochemistry. It would seem that Whewell's early exposure to language predisposed him to being able to find or develop words for scientific ideas. All in all, it's another argument for those who wish to major in STEM fields to also do work in the humanities. Language is a powerful tool, and those seeking to express complex ideas to others would be well served to have a solid grasp of its use. In more community-related matters, a few of the crew have expressed some reluctance about using Facebook given the company's not infrequent missteps when it comes to how it treats its users and the data associated with them. As such, crew member and listener Adam has been kind enough to set up a subreddit for the podcast out on Reddit. If you are one that frequents the self-proclaimed front page of the internet, I would encourage you to search for the Scientific Odyssey subreddit and subscribe. Adam's done a great job of getting that off the ground, and there are a few topics of discussion that we'd love to have you contribute to. You can also post links to science-related content and ask questions about things related to the show. Come check it out. This week's shout-out goes to the folks with NASA's InSight mission. Their lander successfully touched down on the surface of Mars and is going through the preparations to begin to take geologic measurements of the red planet to better determine its composition and structure. One of the experiments that's planned is drilling some 5 meters into the Martian soil and then doing observations of temperature and that sort of thing. This will help determine the possibility of liquid water underneath the planet's surface, as well as determining the planet's density. Very cool stuff indeed. I wonder what our professor of mineralogy, who along with George Airy conducted similar experiments at the bottoms of mines in England, would think of our ability to send a robot to another world to do geology. I imagine that he, John Herschel, and Charles Babbage would be more than thrilled by what we've managed to accomplish in less than 200 years after their work in the fields of geology, chemistry, astronomy, and computing. Next time, we'll take a look at one of the great debates that took place during the Victorian period of England, that between Whewell and the noted philosopher John Stuart Mill on the best way to do scientific inquiry. Until then, full sails on your journey.